Hey guys, tonight we embark upon the chilling tale of Euron Greyjoy, the Crow's Eye, a man who sailed beyond the edge of the known world and returned with powers that would reshape Westeros forever. This is the story of the third son who became a king through blood and sorcery, who commanded dragons through ancient magic, and whose very presence brought storms both literal and metaphorical to the Seven Kingdoms. From his twisted childhood on the iron-bound fortress of Pyke to his reign of supernatural terror across the Reach, Euron's journey is one of ambition without limits, knowledge without wisdom, and power without mercy. So before you settle in for this dark odyssey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into the complex characters of Westeros. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we explore these epic tales together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket and let's ease into tonight's journey through the storm-tossed life of the most feared Greyjoy who ever lived. In the grey dawn of a blood-soaked morning, somewhere off the coast of the Reach, the black-sailed ship's silence cuts through crimson waters like a blade through silk. Her decks run red with more than seawater, and the muted crew moves with the eerie precision of men who have long since abandoned their voices to serve a master who speaks only in whispers and screams. At the prow stands a figure that was once a man, his single blue eye gleaming with an otherworldly light, while where his left eye should be, there sits only shadow and terrible knowledge. This is Euron Greyjoy, and in his hands he holds a horn carved from dragon bone, its surface etched with Valyrian glyphs that seem to writhe and shift in the morning light. When he places it to his lips, the sound that emerges is not of this world, a call that reaches across leagues of ocean to touch the minds of creatures that have not bowed to mortal will since the doom of Valyria. Dragons answer this call, and with them comes the promise of fire and blood that will remake the Seven Kingdoms. But how did the third son of Euron Greyjoy become this creature of shadow and flame? What dark paths did he walk in the smoking ruins of Old Valyria? What prices did he pay in blood and soul to command the very forces that once brought the freehold to its knees? Tonight we shall trace his journey from the salt-stained stones of Pyke to the blood-soaked waters of the Sunset Sea, from a boy who tormented his younger brother in the darkness to a man who would sacrifice thousands to fuel his impossible ambitions. We will sail with him into the far corners of the world, beyond the Summer Isles, and past the jade-green waters of Yeti, to the shadow-haunted ruins of Asshai, where he learned the dark arts that would transform him from mere mortal into something far more terrible. We will witness his return to the Iron Islands at the moment of greatest chaos, when the War of Five Kings had bled Westeros white and left the realm ripe for a new kind of conquest. And we will stand with him on the deck of silence as he unleashes powers that the Maesters claim are myth, watching as dragons soar overhead and the very sea itself bends to his will. For Euron Greyjoy is no mere iron-born raider, no simple king seeking gold and glory. He is a force of nature given human form, a storm that walks on two legs, and his story is the tale of what happens when a man decides that the world itself is not enough to satisfy his hunger for power. The winds are rising now, and in their howling we can hear the echo of that dragon horn, calling across the centuries to powers that should have remained buried with the dragon lords of old. The Crow's Eye has come home to the Iron Islands, and with him comes the promise of an age of darkness unlike anything Westeros has ever known. But every storm has its beginning, and every monster was once just a child. So let us start at the beginning, in the salt spray chambers of Pyke, where young Euron first learned that the world was his to take, if only he was willing to pay the price in blood and soul. The tale of Euron Greyjoy awaits, and it will carry you into the deepest waters of sleep, where dragons swim in dreams and the sound of distant thunder promises both terror and rest. In the year 256 after Aegon's conquest, as autumn storms lashed the iron-grey towers of Pyke, Lady Greyjoy brought forth her third son into a world of salt and stone. The child emerged during the howling of a great gale, and the midwives would later whisper that his first cry harmonized with the wind in a way that made their bones ache with cold. They named him Euron, meaning blessed iron in the old tongue, though none could have foreseen how twisted that blessing would become. Lord Quellan Greyjoy looked upon his newborn son with the same mixture of pride and wariness he showed all his children. The Iron Islands bred hard men for a hard world, and already young Euron's eyes held an intensity that seemed older than his infant body could contain. Even as a babe, those pale blue eyes would follow movement with an awareness that unsettled the servants, as if the child was cataloguing every face and storing away every slight for future reckoning. Pyke itself was a fortress that shaped the souls of all who dwelt within its water-carved walls. Built on a series of sea stacks connected by swaying stone bridges, the castle groaned and shifted with every tide, its foundations constantly battered by waves that had traveled across thousands of miles of gray-green ocean. The sound of the sea was inescapable here, a constant reminder that the Ironborn belonged not to the land but to the endless waters that surrounded their rocky domain. The Greyjoy children grew up breathing salt air and learning that the sea gave and the sea took away, but that a clever man could learn to take more than he gave. Balon the eldest absorbed these lessons with the grim seriousness that would define his reign. Victarion, strong and steady as ship's oak, found his calling in the honest work of sword and sail. Young Euron, barely more than a toddler when Euron was born, would toddle after his older brothers, eager for their attention and approval. But Euron was different from the very beginning. Where his brothers played at war games with wooden swords, Euron preferred to watch and learn, cataloging their weaknesses and strengths with an analytical mind that seemed far too mature for his years. When the castle cats would catch rats in the lower levels, other children might watch with brief interest before running off to other games. Euron would remain, observing the interplay of predator and prey with the focused attention of a maester studying ancient texts. Lord Quellan ruled the Iron Islands during a time of change, attempting to modernize his ancient realm and bring it more in line with the customs of the mainland. He had married a mainland woman as his third wife, sought to establish trade rather than rely solely on reaving, and even went so far as to forbid the taking of salt wives in favor of more civilized marriage customs. These reforms were not popular among the Ironborn, who saw them as a betrayal of the old way, the ancient traditions that had sustained their people for thousands of years. Young Euron absorbed these tensions with the quick intelligence that would serve him throughout his life. He watched his father struggle against the conservative elements of Ironborn society, observed how power flowed and ebbed like the tides around Pyke's foundations. Even as a child, he understood that tradition was simply another form of chain, and that a truly clever man would learn to use both tradition and innovation as tools to achieve his goals. The lessons of childhood came hard and fast in the Iron Islands. Euron learned to swim before he could walk properly, thrown into the castle's sea pools by older cousins and uncles who believed that iron was best forged in the harshest fires. The cold water was his first teacher, showing him that weakness meant death and that survival required constant vigilance. When he finally surfaced, gasping and shivering but alive, his instructors would nod approvingly and throw him in again the next day. Combat training began almost as early. Wooden swords gave way to blunted steel, and blunted steel to sharp edges that left permanent scars. Euron showed natural aptitude with blade and bow, but his true talents lay elsewhere. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to read his opponents, to sense their intentions before they themselves knew what they planned to do. His instructors attributed this to quick reflexes and good training, but Euron was beginning to suspect that his gifts came from somewhere else entirely. It was during these early years that Euron first began to experiment with the darker aspects of his nature. When the castle's cats would disappear, servants assumed they had fallen from the bridges or been taken by the sea. When younger children would wake screaming from nightmares they could not quite remember, their mothers would blame the constant sound of wind and wave. But Euron knew, even if he could not put words to his knowledge, his older brother had a way of appearing in shadows where he should not be, of knowing things he had no way of learning, of making the darkness itself seem to bend around him. The relationship between Euron and Euron became the defining dynamic of both their childhoods. To outsiders, Euron appeared to be a caring older brother, always ready with comfort when little Euron had bad dreams, always willing to include the younger boy in his games and adventures. But in the darkness of Pyke's lower chambers, away from the eyes of parents and servants, Euron began to reveal the true nature of his character. These early cruelties were subtle, designed more to control than to cause lasting physical harm. Euron learned that fear was a more powerful tool than violence, that psychological dominance lasted longer and ran deeper than any beating. He began to understand that people could be shaped and molded like heated iron, that with the right pressure applied in the right places, even the strongest will could be broken down and rebuilt according to his design. As the boys grew older, Euron's experiments in control became more sophisticated. He learned to manipulate not just through fear, but through false kindness, through the withholding and granting of approval, through the careful cultivation of dependence. Euron began to look to his older brother for guidance in all things, never realizing that Euron was systematically stripping away his ability to think and act independently. The other members of House Greyjoy noticed none of this, focused as they were on the larger political currents that swirled around the Iron Islands. Lord Quellen's reforms continued to face resistance, and there were whispers that some of the other Ironborn houses were beginning to question his fitness to rule. Young Balon grew increasingly vocal in his opposition to their father's modernization efforts, arguing that the Ironborn were losing their essential character in pursuit of mainland approval. Into this environment of political tension and family discord, Euron continued to grow and develop, absorbing lessons about power and manipulation that would serve him well in the dark years to come. By his 10th name day he had already learned to present different faces to different audiences, to be the dutiful son before his parents, the loyal brother before Balon and Victarion, and something else entirely in the shadows where only Euron could see his true nature. The salt wind that howled around Pyke's towers carried with it the promise of great storms ahead, and in the depths of those ancient stone chambers a monster was slowly taking shape in the form of a seemingly ordinary Ironborn boy. The death of Lord Quellen Greyjoy at the Battle of the Trident marked the end of an era for the Iron Islands, but more importantly, it ignited a fire in his eldest son that would consume half the realm before it burned itself out. Balon had never approved of his father's attempts to modernize their ancient kingdom, viewing each concession to mainland customs as a betrayal of everything that made the Ironborn unique among the peoples of Westeros. When ravens brought word of his father's death fighting for a usurper king who cared nothing for Ironborn traditions, the new Lord of Pyke saw an opportunity to reclaim the independence that centuries of Targaryen rule had gradually eroded. Euron embraced his brother's rebellion with an enthusiasm that surprised even those who knew him well. At 33 years of age, he had developed into a formidable presence whose reputation for cunning was matched only by his skill in naval warfare. The years spent learning the family trade had honed his natural talents into something approaching genius, his understanding of wind and current, allowing him to position his ships with precision that seemed almost supernatural to less gifted sailors. When Balon called his banners in the name of independence, Euron answered with a squadron of longships whose crews had been personally selected for their combination of skill and absolute loyalty to their captain. The early months of what would become known as Greyjoy's Rebellion exceeded even the most optimistic Ironborn expectations. Robert Baratheon's new regime was still consolidating power after the devastating civil war that had toppled the Targaryens, leaving the Iron Throne vulnerable to challenges from enemies who understood how to exploit weakness when it presented itself. The Ironborn possessed advantages that their enemies had forgotten during the long years of peace, their ships faster and their crews more experienced in the deadly art of sea warfare than any force the mainland could quickly assemble. Euron's tactical brilliance became apparent during the rebellion's opening campaigns, his ability to predict enemy movements and exploit their weaknesses, earning him recognition as one of the finest naval commanders of his generation. He seemed to possess an almost mystical understanding of his opponent's psychology, positioning his forces exactly where they could achieve maximum impact, while avoiding the concentrated responses that might have overwhelmed smaller squadrons. His crews spoke in hushed tones of their captain's uncanny ability to navigate in the thickest fog or find safe harbor when pursued by superior numbers. The burning of Lannisport represented both the rebellion's greatest triumph and the moment when Euron first glimpsed the true scope of what might be possible for someone willing to push beyond conventional limitations. The Lannister fleet had been anchored in what should have been perfect security, protected by harbor defenses that had been refined over centuries of successful commerce. Yet somehow, through methods that remained mysterious even to his own allies, Euron found ways to penetrate every barrier and bring fire to the very heart of enemy naval power. The night sky above Lannisport burned with flames that could be seen for 50 leagues in every direction, a beacon of Ironborn defiance that announced to all of Westeros that the Reavers had returned with capabilities that exceeded anything their ancestors had possessed. In the orange glow of burning warships, Euron felt something awakening within himself, a hunger that mere victory could never satisfy. The destruction he had orchestrated was magnificent, but it was only the beginning of what he might accomplish if he could find ways to transcend the limitations that constrained ordinary men. The rebellion's momentum carried the Ironborn to victories that seemed to validate every boast their poets had ever composed about their people's martial superiority. Coastal settlements from Bear Island to the Arbor felt the bite of Ironborn steel as raiding parties struck with the precision of wolves culling sheep from an unguarded flock. The mainland lords who had grown soft during years of peace discovered that their traditional defenses were inadequate against enemies who fought according to rules that prioritized effectiveness over honor. But Euron's analytical mind recognized weaknesses in their position that his brother's enthusiasm refused to acknowledge. The Ironborn could win individual battles through superior seamanship and fierce courage, but they lacked the industrial capacity to sustain prolonged warfare against enemies who could replace their losses faster than raiders could inflict them. When he attempted to voice these concerns during the rebellion's planning sessions, Balon dismissed them as defeatism, unworthy of a true son of the Iron Islands. The turning point came when Robert Baratheon demonstrated that his reputation as a warrior was matched by considerable strategic acumen. The king's response to Ironborn aggression was swift and overwhelming, mobilizing resources on a scale that transformed what had seemed like a regional conflict into something approaching total war. The royal fleet that assembled to crush Ironborn resistance incorporated lessons learned from previous naval engagements. Their ships built to mainland specifications with mainland gold, but crewed by sailors who had studied Ironborn tactics until they could counter them effectively. The siege of Pyke began with the systematic destruction of everything that had made Ironborn naval superiority possible. One by one, the longships that had carried fire to Lannisport were hunted down and destroyed, their crews adding to the growing toll of a rebellion that had promised glory but delivered only death. Euron watched from Pyke's walls as his remaining vessels limped home, their ranks decimated and their surviving crews broken by defeats that seemed to contradict everything the Ironborn believed about their own capabilities. The fortress itself withstood the siege longer than anyone had expected, its unique construction and strategic position making direct assault nearly impossible for forces that lacked adequate naval support. But isolation eventually accomplished what enemy armies could not achieve through direct attack. Cut off from the resources that sustained their war effort, the Ironborn discovered that courage alone was insufficient to maintain resistance against enemies whose patience was matched by overwhelming numerical superiority. Family tensions that had simmered throughout the rebellion finally erupted during these final desperate months. Euron's criticism of Balin's strategic decisions became increasingly pointed, his suggestions for alternative approaches growing more desperate as their position deteriorated beyond any possibility of conventional recovery. When his brother began considering terms for surrender, Euron's disgust was palpable. The Ironborn did not negotiate with enemies who lacked the strength to defeat them in honest combat. The incident that would ultimately cost Euron his place in Ironborn society occurred during these dark final days of the rebellion. Whether driven by genuine desire or calculated manipulation, he began an affair with his brother Victarion's wife, a woman whose beauty had caught his attention months earlier, but who had been beyond his reach while family loyalty constrained his actions. The relationship developed with the intensity that desperate circumstances can create, offering both participants escape from the grinding reality of their deteriorating position. When the affair was discovered, it provided Balin with the perfect excuse to rid himself of a brother whose presence had become politically inconvenient. The confrontation took place in Pyke's Great Hall, with the remnants of Ironborn nobility gathered to witness what amounted to a formal trial. Balin's accusations were delivered with the cold precision of a man who had found the ideal weapon against an enemy he could no longer tolerate, while Euron's response revealed depths of cynicism that shocked even hardened reavers who thought they understood his character. Rather than denying the charges or expressing remorse for actions that violated fundamental Ironborn customs regarding family loyalty, Euron spoke of larger truths that made personal obligations seem petty by comparison. He described visions of power that transcended the small ambitions of island raiders, hinting at knowledge gained from sources that conventional Ironborn education could never have provided. His words carried implications that made even seasoned warriors uncomfortable, suggesting capabilities that existed beyond normal human understanding. The sentence of exile was pronounced with ceremonial formality that emphasized the finality of Euron's separation from everything that had previously defined his identity. As he prepared the silence for departure, to gathering crew members whose loyalty was secured through bonds that went deeper than gold or family obligation, Euron regarded Pyke's storm-lashed towers not with sadness, but with anticipation of adventures that would dwarf anything he had experienced as merely another Ironborn prince. The ship slipped away from Lordsport on a morning when fog hung so thick that watchers on the harbor walls could barely distinguish between sea and sky. By the time visibility cleared, Euron Greyjoy had vanished into the vastness of the Western Ocean, beginning a journey that would take him beyond the boundaries of the known world and transform him into something far more dangerous than the exiled nobleman who had departed in apparent disgrace. Freedom tasted like salt spray and boundless horizon as the silence cut through waters that grew stranger with each passing league. Euron had chosen his ship's name with characteristic precision. Her crew would speak no words of his business to curious ears, their tongues having been removed in the ritual that bound them to his service. This was not cruelty born of madness, but calculation refined to its purest essence. In the world beyond Westeros, information was more valuable than gold and far more dangerous than any sword. The first months of exile brought encounters that would have broken lesser men. Pirates operating in the stepstones learned to flee at the sight of black sails, their own cruelty seeming childish compared to the methodical violence that Euron employed against those who stood in his way. But these early victories were merely preparation for far greater ambitions. While other exiled lords might content themselves with mercenary work or comfortable exile in the free cities, Euron's hunger drove him toward horizons that existed only in the most ancient charts. His crew grew slowly but steadily, drawn from the desperate and the damned who haunted harbor taverns across Essos. Slavers' Bay provided murderers fleeing justice. The free cities offered sellswords whose contracts had ended in blood and betrayal, and the Summer Isles yielded warriors whose skills were matched only by their willingness to follow a captain who promised adventures beyond the edge of mapped seas. Each new member underwent the same ritual, their voices sacrificed to ensure absolute loyalty and perfect silence. The transformation of these disparate criminals into a unified fighting force revealed Euron's true genius for leadership. He understood that shared suffering created bonds stronger than gold or fear, that men who had endured the same trials would follow their leader into any danger. The cutting of tongues became a rite of passage that separated his crew from all other sailors, marking them as belonging to something larger and more terrible than any conventional pirate band. Navigation in these unknown waters required skills that went far beyond traditional seamanship. Euron began to develop abilities that his crew attributed to supernatural insight, but which he knew came from careful study of patterns that others missed. The flight of certain seabirds revealed the location of distant islands. The color of deep water indicated currents that could carry a ship hundreds of leagues off course, and the behavior of sea creatures provided warnings about storms that conventional weather signs would miss entirely. The Summer Isles became his first true testing ground, their golden beaches hiding complexities that had escaped centuries of casual visitors. Here, Euron encountered magic for the first time, not as legend or children's tale, but as living reality practiced by people who had never forgotten the old ways. The island priests possessed knowledge that made Westerosi meisters seem like children playing with toys they could never understand. Their ceremonies involved transformations of consciousness that opened doors to perceptions far beyond ordinary human experience. Euron approached these mysteries with the same analytical mind that had made him a formidable naval tactician. Where other visitors might be content to trade for gold and spices, he sought deeper understanding of the forces that powered such impossible feats. The priests recognized something in him that set him apart from typical mainland visitors, a hunger for knowledge that transcended mere curiosity and bordered on obsession. The lessons he learned among the tall black stones of the Summer Islander temples would serve him well in the trials ahead. Pain could be transformed into power if properly channeled, fear could be transmuted into loyalty if skillfully applied, and death itself could become a doorway to abilities that the living could barely comprehend. These were not abstract philosophical concepts but practical techniques that Euron began to incorporate into his own methods of command and control. Slavers' Bay offered different but equally valuable education. Here, among the ancient pyramids that had stood since before the dragons came to Westeros, Euron learned how civilizations could be built on foundations of carefully managed cruelty. The good masters of Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen had refined slavery into an art form that sustained their power across centuries of political upheaval and military threat. Their methods were instructive for a man planning conquests that would dwarf any Ironborn raid. But it was in the markets of these ancient cities that Euron first encountered artifacts that would reshape his understanding of what was possible. Valyrian steel weapons were common enough among the wealthy merchants, but there were other items whose purposes were less obvious and far more intriguing. Books written in languages that predated the Doom, carved stones that hummed with barely contained energies, and sealed containers whose contents seemed to shift and whisper when no one was watching. The acquisition of these mysteries required more than gold. Knowledge had its own currency among those who trafficked in the remnants of dead civilizations, and Euron proved remarkably adept at earning the trust of scholars and sorcerers who had spent lifetimes studying forces that most people refused to acknowledge existed. His reputation for keeping bargains and protecting secrets made him valuable to networks that operated in the shadows of legitimate commerce. As the months turned to years, the silence began to carry cargo that would have terrified the most hardened pirates. Ancient texts described rituals that could bend reality to the practitioner's will, preserved organs from creatures that had never drawn natural breath, and weapons forged in fires that had been extinguished for centuries. Euron's cabin became a repository of knowledge that chronicled the rise and fall of powers that made contemporary kingdoms seem like children's games. The journey to Yi Ti represented a quantum leap in both distance and danger. The jade waters that surrounded the legendary empire held perils that had claimed thousands of ships whose captains lacked either the skill or the supernatural guidance necessary for safe passage. Euron navigated these hazards with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, his growing abilities allowing him to sense safe routes through mazes of hidden reefs and supernatural storms. Yi Ti itself exceeded every legend that had reached Westerosi ears. Cities larger than King's Landing stretched along coastlines that seemed to extend forever, their architecture incorporating mathematical principles that created structures of impossible beauty and durability. The Azure Emperor's court contained scholars whose libraries held knowledge accumulated over thousands of years of unbroken civilization. Here Euron encountered magic that had been refined and systematized in ways that made Westerosi sorcery seem primitive by comparison. The shadow binders of Asshai represented the culmination of his eastern journey. These practitioners of the darkest arts lived in a city where the sun never shone, and the very stones seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their knowledge had been purchased with prices that would have horrified anyone retaining normal human empathy, but the power they wielded made such concerns seem irrelevant to larger purposes. Euron's education in Asshai lasted longer than all his previous stops combined. The Shadow Binders recognized in him a student capable of grasping concepts that had driven lesser minds to madness or death. Their teachings involved the manipulation of forces that existed in the spaces between reality and dream, the harnessing of energies that flowed from sources beyond the physical world, and the achievement of purposes that transcended normal human desires. It was in Asshai that Euron lost his eye, though whether through accident or design remained a mystery that he never fully explained. The sacrifice opened new avenues of perception that more than compensated for the loss of normal sight. Where once he had seen only the physical world, now he could perceive the currents of power that flowed beneath apparent reality, the connections that bound all things in webs of cause and effect that extended across time and space. The greatest prize of his Asshai education was not knowledge, but an artifact that would define his future conquests. The dragon horn had been crafted in the final days of the Valyrian freehold, its creation requiring the sacrifice of an entire bloodline of dragon riders, whose deaths powered the magic that would allow lesser men to command the greatest of all magical creatures. Euron's acquisition of this relic marked his transformation from ambitious exile to genuine threat to the established order of the known world. As he prepared to leave Asshai, Euron was no longer the man who had departed the Iron Islands in shame and fury. Years of travel, study, and transformation had created something new, a hybrid of iron-born ambition and Eastern mysticism that possessed capabilities far beyond either tradition alone. The Silence turned westward carrying a crew of mutes, a hold full of impossible artifacts, and a captain whose single eye now gleamed with knowledge that would reshape the very foundations of Westerosi power. The transformation that had begun in the shadow-haunted streets of Asshai reached its culmination in waters where no sane sailor would dare venture. The smoking sea stretched before the silence like a wound in the world itself, its surface disturbed by currents that had nothing to do with wind or tide, and everything to do with forces unleashed centuries ago when Valyria met its doom. Here, where the very air shimmered with residual magic and the water ran strange colors that had no names in any language, Euron would complete his metamorphosis from mortal man to something far more terrible. The decision to enter these cursed waters had not been made lightly. Every port from Volantis to Lys contained sailors who could recite lists of ships that had vanished, attempting to penetrate the mysteries of Old Valyria's grave. The smoking sea consumed vessels and crews with impartial hunger, leaving behind only cautionary tales that grew more elaborate with each retelling. But Euron possessed advantages that other explorers lacked, knowledge purchased in blood and sacrifice that allowed him to navigate hazards that would have destroyed conventional expeditions. The preparations for this final voyage had taken months of careful planning. His crew underwent additional rituals that bound them even more tightly to his will, their very souls becoming extensions of his own consciousness through techniques learned from the shadow binders of Ashai. The Silence herself was modified with protective wards carved into her hull, symbols that required regular renewal with substances that no civilized man would willingly handle. These preparations were not superstitions but practical necessities for survival in waters where reality itself had been fundamentally altered. The first signs of Valyria's lingering power appeared while they were still leagues from the actual ruins. The sea began to glow with phosphorescence that moved in patterns too complex to be natural, forming spirals and geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Fish began to appear that bore no resemblance to any species in the Meister's bestiaries, their scales gleaming with metallic sheens and their eyes reflecting intelligence that was decidedly unnatural. The very air grew thick with energies that made breathing difficult and thinking even more so. Euron stood at the prow of his ship as these wonders unfolded around him, his single eye taking in details that would have driven lesser men to madness. The knowledge he had gained in Ashai allowed him to interpret what others would see only as inexplicable phenomena. The glowing patterns in the water were remnants of massive spells that had been designed to protect the Valyrian peninsula from invasion. The mutated sea life represented evolution accelerated and directed by magical forces that still operated according to principles established by the Dragon Lords. Even the air itself carried information for those trained to decode its messages. Navigation through these supernatural hazards required abilities that went far beyond conventional seamanship. Euron found himself relying increasingly on senses that had no names in ordinary language, perceptions that allowed him to detect safe passages through fields of magical energy that would have torn apart any conventional vessel. His crew followed his directions with the absolute faith of men who knew their captain possessed knowledge that transcended normal human understanding. The ruins of Valyria itself exceeded every description that had survived the doom. Towers of fused stone reached toward a sky that seemed permanently stained with smoke and ash, their surfaces covered with symbols that continued to pulse with faint luminescence after 4 centuries of abandonment. Streets that had once carried the greatest sorcerers in human history now lay buried under drifts of ash that preserved rather than destroyed, maintaining the city in a state of suspended animation that was neither life nor death. Euron walked these empty boulevards with the reverence of a pilgrim entering a holy site. Every step brought him closer to understanding the true scope of what the Valyrians had achieved and lost. Their mastery of magic had reached levels that made contemporary sorcery seem like children's games with dangerous toys. They had bound dragons to their will, reshaped continents to serve their purposes, and created works of art that incorporated principles of reality manipulation that the wisest scholars of his own era could barely comprehend. But it was in the depths of the Dragonlord palaces that Euron found the greatest treasures. sealed chambers contained libraries of spellwork that chronicled the development of magical theory across centuries of unbroken research. Laboratory spaces held equipment designed to manipulate forces that most people refused to believe existed. And hidden in the deepest vaults, protected by wards that had required the sacrifice of entire bloodlines to create, lay artifacts whose power had been too dangerous to use even during the height of Valyrian civilization. The dragon horn stood in a place of honor among these relics, its surface carved with binding runes that seemed to move and shift when viewed directly. Euron recognized it immediately from descriptions found in the most forbidden texts of Asshai, understanding both its potential and the terrible price that would be required to unlock its full power. The horn had been crafted to control dragons through magical compulsion, but its use demanded sacrifices that would horrify anyone retaining normal human morality. The process of claiming these artifacts required rituals that transformed Euron as much as they empowered him. Each item extracted its own price in blood and soul, stripping away layers of humanity that had already been worn thin by years of exposure to forces beyond normal comprehension. The power he gained was real and substantial, but it came at the cost of connections to ordinary human experience that he would never be able to recover. Other discoveries in the Valyrian ruins provided different but equally valuable forms of knowledge. Texts describing the breeding and control of dragons revealed techniques that went far beyond the crude methods employed by contemporary Targaryen dragon riders. Architectural principles incorporated magical theory that could create structures capable of channeling and focusing supernatural energies. Even mundane objects like jewelry and household items contained subtle enchantments that demonstrated mastery of forces that modern smiths and craftsmen could not begin to replicate. But the greatest prize was not any single artifact, but the understanding of how magic truly functioned. The Valyrians had developed theoretical frameworks that treated sorcery as a science rather than a collection of half-understood traditions. Their approach was systematic and reproducible, based on principles that could be taught and learned rather than mysterious gifts that appeared randomly in exceptional individuals. This knowledge represented the difference between a hedge wizard throwing fireballs and a true sorcerer reshaping reality according to his will. The return journey from Valyria tested every skill and ability that Euron had acquired during his years of exile. The Smoking Sea fought to keep its secrets, unleashing storms of magical energy that threatened to tear apart both ship and crew. Creatures that had been given new and terrible forms by centuries of exposure to residual magic attacked with intelligence that suggested they retained memories of their original human nature. Even the ocean itself seemed to have developed a malevolent consciousness that resented intrusion into its cursed domain. Euron navigated these perils with abilities that were no longer entirely human. His lost eye had been replaced by perceptions that allowed him to see currents of power invisible to normal sight. His mind had been expanded to process information according to patterns learned from the Shadowbinders of Asshai, and his will had been hardened by experiences that would have shattered anyone less thoroughly prepared for the costs of ultimate knowledge. When the Silence finally emerged from the Smoking Sea, she carried cargo that represented the accumulated magical wisdom of the greatest civilization in human history. But more importantly, she carried a captain who had been transformed by his experiences into something that was no longer bound by the limitations that constrained ordinary mortals. Euron Greyjoy had entered Valyrian waters as an exiled Ironborn prince. He emerged as a force of nature given human form, possessing knowledge and power that would soon reshape the political landscape of Westeros in ways that no one could anticipate. From the rolling deck of the Silence, anchored in waters so distant that Westeros seemed like a half-remembered dream, Euron watched the world shift like pieces on a Sivassi board. His network of informants stretched across the known world, a web of spies and sellswords who fed him information with the regularity of tides. Through their whispered reports, he he learned of events that would reshape the Seven Kingdoms and create opportunities that a patient man might exploit to devastating effect. The death of Jon Arryn had been merely the first falling stone in an avalanche that would bury the old order. Euron received word of the Hand's passing while raiding the merchant lanes near Lys, but unlike other exiles who might see only another piece of court gossip, he understood the deeper implications. Arryn had been the keystone holding together the delicate balance of power that Robert's reign depended upon. Without his steady hand guiding policy and managing the realm's debts, the Iron Throne would become vulnerable in ways that its occupants had never fully comprehended. King Robert's journey to Winterfell provided the next crucial development in what Euron was beginning to recognize as a sequence of events too convenient to be entirely accidental. The Fat King's decision to name Ned Stark as his new Hand seemed logical enough to outside observers, but Euron saw the trap being set. Stark possessed all the qualities that made for an honorable lord, but none of the flexibility that successful southern politics required. His northern sense of duty would drive him to investigate matters that wiser men would leave undisturbed. The revelation of Queen Cersei's infidelity struck Euron as both predictable and perfectly timed. Years of sailing the free cities had given him ample opportunity to observe Lannister behavior, and Cersei's particular combination of arrogance and recklessness made such discoveries inevitable. What impressed him was not the scandal itself, but how it had been allowed to fester until precisely the moment when its exposure would cause maximum chaos. Someone with exceptional patience and planning skills had orchestrated these revelations for maximum political impact. Ned Stark's execution provided confirmation that the careful order Robert had maintained through personal loyalty and shared battlefield experiences was dissolving into something far more dangerous. The Honorable Lord of Winterfell had discovered truths that powerful people needed to remain hidden, and his death sent a clear message that the old rules no longer applied. In the resulting chaos, traditional alliances would crumble, and new opportunities would emerge for those bold enough to seize them. The outbreak of war between the Starks and Lannisters created exactly the conditions that Euron had been waiting for. While mainland lords gathered their banners for what they imagined would be a brief and decisive campaign, he understood that this conflict would spread like wildfire through kindling. Too many old grievances had been left unresolved, too many ambitious lords had been kept in check only by fear of royal retribution, and too many regions harbored resentments that would boil over once central authority weakened. Young Robb Stark's early victories impressed even Euron's cynical assessment of mainland military capabilities. The boy possessed genuine tactical ability and had inherited enough of his father's leadership qualities to inspire fierce loyalty among his followers, but Euron also recognized the fundamental weakness in the northern strategy. Robb was fighting a war of honor, while his enemies were prepared to use any means necessary to achieve victory. Such moral asymmetry rarely favored the more principled side. The emergence of multiple claimants to the Iron Throne transformed what might have been a regional conflict into something approaching the chaos that Euron's plans required. Stannis Baratheon brought legal legitimacy and military competence, but lacked the political flexibility needed for successful kingship. Renly offered charm and substantial resources but possessed neither the legal claim nor the ruthless determination that successful usurpation demanded. Both brothers would weaken each other while strengthening whoever survived their inevitable confrontation. Balon's decision to join the war as an independent claimant represented both opportunity and frustration for Euron's larger purposes. His brother's timing was excellent, striking at the north while Robb's armies were committed in the south, and leaving the region vulnerable to the kind of rapid conquest that Ironborn forces excelled at. But Balon's strategic vision remained limited to traditional reaving and raiding, missing the larger possibilities that the collapse of royal authority presented. The Ironborn invasion of the north proceeded exactly as Euron had expected, with initial successes followed by increasingly difficult consolidation efforts. Theon's capture of Winterfell represented both the rebellion's greatest triumph and the beginning of its ultimate failure. Taking the Stark stronghold provided enormous symbolic value and demonstrated Ironborn capabilities to audiences across Westeros, but holding territory so far from the sea stretched their logistical capabilities beyond sustainable limits. From his distant anchorage, Euron observed these developments with the detached interest of a natural philosopher studying the behavior of laboratory specimens. Each victory and defeat provided valuable information about the capabilities and limitations of the various factions, knowledge that would prove invaluable when the time came for his own intervention. The Ironborn were performing adequately but not exceptionally, winning battles through superior naval mobility while failing to develop the administrative capabilities needed for permanent conquest. The Battle of Blackwater marked a crucial turning point that confirmed Euron's analysis of the conflict's likely trajectory. Stannis's defeat eliminated the most competent military commander among the royal claimants, while simultaneously demonstrating the continued strength of Lannister resources when properly deployed. The use of wildfire in the battle also suggested that someone in King's Landing possessed access to destructive capabilities that went beyond conventional military wisdom. Robb's marriage to Jane Westerling represented exactly the kind of emotional decision-making that Euron had learned to exploit in his enemies. The young king in the north had allowed personal desire to override political necessity, alienating crucial allies for the sake of honor and love. Such choices might be admirable from certain perspectives, but they also created vulnerabilities that more ruthless opponents would inevitably exploit. The Red Wedding arrived like a thunderclap that illuminated the true nature of the conflict Euron had been observing. Lord Walder Frey's betrayal of guest right and the systematic elimination of northern leadership demonstrated that the war had moved far beyond conventional political rivalry into something approaching the complete breakdown of civilized conduct. Such conditions created opportunities for intervention that would have been impossible under more stable circumstances. News of Robb's death reached Euron while he was concluding negotiations with a particularly useful group of corsairs operating near the Stepstones. The young wolf's destruction removed the most significant obstacle to renewed Ironborn expansion, while simultaneously creating a power vacuum in the north that his brother would be unable to exploit effectively. More importantly, it demonstrated that the traditional rules governing Westerosi politics had been permanently suspended, opening possibilities that had previously existed only in the realm of theory. As reports of subsequent developments continued to flow in through his network of informants, Euron began to recognize the approaching culmination of years of careful waiting. The Iron Throne's hold on peripheral regions was weakening. Powerful lords were discovering that betrayal could be more profitable than loyalty, and the magical forces that had slumbered since the dragon's death were beginning to stir once again. All the pieces were falling into place for a gambit that would dwarf anything attempted during the current conflict. The only question remaining was timing, and Euron had learned that patience was often the difference between success and spectacular failure. The storm that claimed Balon Greyjoy arrived with unnatural fury, lashing Pyke with winds that seemed to carry voices from beyond the grave. On a night when sensible men sought shelter behind thick stone walls, the Lord of the Iron Islands walked alone across the swaying rope bridge that connected the main keep to the sea tower. His guards found his body the next morning, broken on the rocks below, while the tempest that had killed him vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The official explanation spoke of treacherous winds and rain-slicked stone, the kind of accident that had claimed countless Ironborn over the centuries. But whispers in Lord Sport's taverns carried darker theories, and men who had sailed with Euron in younger days recalled his uncanny ability to predict weather patterns that seemed to follow his desires rather than natural law. The timing of Balon's death was too convenient, arriving precisely when the Iron Islands needed new leadership and the exiled brother possessed both motive and opportunity to claim his birthright. Euron Damfair performed the funeral rites with hands that trembled more than age alone could explain. As he spoke the ancient words that would send his brother to the drowned god's watery halls, the priest felt a presence watching from the shadows of Pyke's great hall. The sensation was impossible to shake, a certainty that something or someone was waiting just beyond the edge of perception, patient as the tide and twice as inevitable. When he called for the Kingsmoot, Euron told himself it was duty that motivated him, but deep in his heart he knew it was fear. The first King's Moot in more than 4,000 years drew claimants from across the Iron Islands and beyond. House Greyjoy arrived with supporters who believed the Ironborn needed new approaches for changing times. Her speeches full of pragmatic wisdom about trade routes and defensive alliances. Various lesser captains put forth their own claims, each citing ancient precedents and heroic bloodlines that supposedly qualified them for the throne. But the gathering's attention remained fixed on the empty horizon, waiting for a ship that might or might not come. Victarion commanded the largest faction, his reputation for honest violence appealing to traditionalists who wanted a return to the old way without the complications that Balon's subtle politics had introduced. The Iron Captain possessed undeniable credentials as a warrior and leader, having proven his courage in battles from the Stepstones to the Shield Islands. His claim carried the weight of competence and continuity, offering stability in uncertain times when enemies gathered on all sides of their island kingdom. The lords and captains who had sailed the narrow sea brought disturbing reports of changes that went beyond ordinary political upheaval. Dragons had returned to the world in the form of a young queen whose armies were reshaping Slaver's Bay according to principles that threatened established orders everywhere. Magic was stirring in corners where it had slumbered since the doom of Valyria, and wise men spoke in hushed tones of prophecies that described the world's ending in fire and ice. These developments suggested opportunities for those bold enough to seize them, but they also carried risks that could destroy any lord who miscalculated. 3 days into the King's Moot, when speeches had grown repetitive and the assembled crowds had begun to grow restless, black sails appeared on the horizon, like a stain spreading across clean water. The silence approached Naga's Hill with the deliberate slowness of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to flee. Her crew moved about their duties with the eerie coordination of men who communicated through gestures and expressions alone, their mutilated tongues a testament to their captain's dedication to secrecy and control. Euron Greyjoy strode up the beach as if he had never left, his appearance both familiar and utterly transformed. The years of exile had carved new lines in his face and added gray to his hair, but these changes paled beside the aura of power that surrounded him like heat radiating from forge fires. His missing eye was concealed behind a patch of black leather that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, while his remaining eye held depths that made even hardened reavers uncomfortable to meet directly. The gifts he distributed among the assembled captains revealed both wealth and connections that exceeded anything previously seen in the Iron Islands. Valyrian steel daggers with hilts carved from dragonbone went to ship's captains whose loyalty could prove useful, while chests of gold and precious stones bought the support of lesser lords who had come to the King's Moot hoping for exactly such opportunities. But the most impressive presents were items whose purposes remained mysterious, artifacts that hummed with barely contained energies and seemed to whisper secrets in languages that predated recorded history. Victarion supporters found their certainty eroding as Euron's presence began to dominate the gathering. The Iron Captain himself stood like a stone monument, his broad shoulders and scarred hands a testament to decades of honest fighting. But even he seemed diminished beside his brother's unsettling magnetism. The two men had barely spoken since Euron's return, their shared history creating tensions that no amount of family loyalty could entirely overcome. Asha's practical proposals for modernizing the Ironborn began to seem inadequate when set against the cosmic scope of her uncle's ambitions. She spoke of establishing permanent trade relationships and building defensive alliances with mainland powers, sensible approaches that offered real benefits for her people's long-term survival. But Euron promised dragons and conquest on a scale that would remake the entire world, visions that appealed to deeper aspects of the Ironborn character than mere economic prosperity ever could. The revelation of the Dragonhorn transformed the entire nature of the competition. Euron's casual display of the artifact's power, demonstrated through the sacrifice of one of his own crew members, proved that he possessed capabilities that went far beyond conventional military resources. The man who blew the horn died screaming as his lungs burned to ash, but not before the sound it produced shook the very foundations of Naga's Hill and sent shivers of recognition through every person who heard it. Those who had read the oldest chronicles recognized descriptions of similar horns from the height of Valyrian power, instruments used to bind dragons to their rider's will through magical compulsion rather than the uncertain loyalty that natural bonding provided. The implications were staggering for anyone who understood that dragons had indeed returned to the world, flying above Slaver's Bay under the command of a young queen, whose ambitions might soon extend to Westeros itself. The Kingsmoot's conclusion felt inevitable, even before the final speeches were delivered. Captain after captain declared for Euron Greyjoy, their voices carrying conviction that ranged from genuine enthusiasm to carefully concealed terror. Even those who might have preferred other outcomes recognized the futility of opposing a claimant who possessed both supernatural power and the ruthless determination to use it without mercy or restraint. Victarion's submission represented the most crucial moment in securing Euron's victory. The Iron Captain's public acknowledgement of his brother's kingship removed the last significant obstacle to unified Ironborn support, though careful observers noted the rigid control with which Victarion delivered his oath. The relationship between the brothers carried currents of resentment and fear that would complicate future cooperation, but for the moment pragmatic necessity overrode personal grievances. Euron's horror at the outcome was visible to anyone who cared to look, though the priest attempted to maintain the facade of religious neutrality that his position as Kingsmoot's spiritual guide demanded. The Damfair understood better than anyone else present exactly what kind of creature his brother had become during the years of exile, and the prospect of such power being exercised over the Ironborn filled him with dread that went beyond ordinary political concerns. The new king's first commands revealed both the scope of his ambitions and the methods he planned to employ in achieving them. Victarion would take the Iron Fleet to Slaver's Bay, ostensibly to court the Dragon Queen, but actually to secure her dragons through whatever means proved necessary. The remaining Ironborn forces would prepare for the largest invasion in their people's history, targeting the wealthy lands of the Reach where disruption of food supplies might bring the entire continent to its knees. As night fell over Pyke following Euron's coronation, the Iron Islands felt different than they had for generations. The change was subtle but unmistakable, like the shift in atmospheric pressure that preceded great storms. Something new and terrible had taken root in the ancient seat of Ironborn power, and its influence would spread across the waters until it touched every shore where ambitious men dreamed of conquest and glory. The crown that Euron wore bore no resemblance to the simple circlets favored by his predecessors. Forged from metal that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it, the driftwood crown had been transformed through processes that combined ancient Valyrian techniques with knowledge acquired in the shadow-haunted temples of the Shai. When he placed it upon his head during the coronation ceremony, witnesses swore they could hear the distant sound of waves breaking against shores that existed in no earthly ocean. Consolidating power over the fractured Iron Islands required skills that went far beyond the conventional threats and rewards that previous kings had employed. Euron understood that fear was most effective when combined with genuine benefits, that men who profited from serving him would prove more reliable than those who submitted only to avoid destruction. His first weeks as king were spent weaving webs of obligation and dependency that would bind potential rivals to his cause through their own self-interest. The lords who had opposed him at the Kingsmoot found their hostility melting away as Euron demonstrated the practical advantages of his exotic connections. Trade routes that had been closed to Ironborn ships for generations suddenly opened, offering access to markets in Yi and the Summer Isles that promised wealth beyond anything traditional reaving could provide. Mysterious cargoes began arriving at Lordsport, their contents distributed among supporters with a precision that made clear how thoroughly the new king understood the desires and weaknesses of his subjects. Victarion's continued presence posed the most delicate challenge to Euron's authority. The Iron Captain commanded genuine respect among traditionalist factions who valued martial prowess above supernatural abilities, and his record of loyal service to the previous regime made him a natural focal point for any organized resistance. But Euron had learned subtlety during his years of exile, approaching his brother's loyalty through manipulation rather than confrontation. The mission to Slavers Bay represented a masterstroke of political calculation disguised as generous delegation of authority. By entrusting Victarion with command of the Iron Fleet, Euron appeared to be honoring his brother's capabilities, while actually removing the most dangerous potential rival from the immediate vicinity. The quest for dragons provided sufficient grandeur to appeal to Victarion's sense of honor while serving Euron's larger strategic purposes, regardless of its ultimate success or failure. Asha's opposition required different handling, her intelligence and political connections making direct confrontation inadvisable until Euron's position became more secure. Rather than risk martyring her through obvious persecution, he chose to isolate her through a campaign of systematic exclusion that gradually stripped away her support base while maintaining the appearance of familial courtesy. Her eventual departure from the Iron Islands came to seem like voluntary exile rather than forced removal, preserving the fiction of family unity that Euron found politically useful. The transformation of Pyke itself reflected the new king's determination to reshape Ironborn culture according to his vision. Chambers that had stood empty for centuries were reopened and fitted with furnishings that combined practical utility with subtle displays of supernatural power. The Great Hall now contained artifacts from across the known world, their placement carefully calculated to create an atmosphere that was both magnificent and vaguely threatening to visitors who lacked proper appreciation for their new ruler's capabilities. The religious implications of Euron's reign created complications that required careful navigation. The drowned god had sustained Ironborn identity for thousands of years, providing spiritual justification for their harsh way of life and cultural distinctiveness from mainland peoples. But Euron's obvious dabbling in foreign magics raised questions about his continued loyalty to traditional faith, creating opportunities for priestly opposition that could prove dangerous if allowed to develop unchecked. Euron Damfair represented the most immediate threat from religious quarters, his combination of genuine piety and institutional authority making him uniquely positioned to challenge the new king's legitimacy. But Euron possessed advantages in this struggle that went beyond mere political maneuvering. The techniques he had learned in Asshai included methods for manipulating consciousness and memory that could break even the strongest religious convictions when properly applied over sufficient time. The Iron Fleet's departure for Slavers Bay marked a crucial milestone in Euron's consolidation of power. With Victarion safely distant and occupied with his assigned mission, potential rivals found their options for organized resistance severely limited. The remaining naval forces were redistributed among captains whose loyalty had been secured through a combination of rewards and carefully applied pressure, creating a command structure that answered directly to the king rather than traditional clan hierarchies. Preparations for the invasion of the Reach revealed the full scope of Euron's strategic vision. Unlike previous Ironborn raids that had targeted isolated coastal settlements for quick strikes and rapid withdrawal, this campaign was designed to achieve permanent conquest of territory whose agricultural wealth could sustain expanded operations indefinitely. The scale of planning required for such ambitious undertakings demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond anything his predecessors had attempted. The recruitment of additional forces proceeded through methods that would have horrified traditional Ironborn sensibilities. Mercenary companies from across Essos were hired through networks that Euron had established during his years of exile, their expertise in mainland warfare complementing the naval superiority that remained the Ironborn's greatest military asset. These foreign fighters brought with them knowledge of siege techniques and land-based logistics that would prove essential for holding territory once it was conquered. But the most disturbing aspect of Euron's military preparations involved practices that clearly derived from his education in the darkest magical arts. Rituals performed in Pyke's deepest chambers required sacrifices that gradually stripped away any pretense that the new king remained bound by conventional moral constraints. The power gained through these ceremonies was real and substantial, but its cost in human suffering created debts that would eventually demand payment in ways that no amount of conquest could satisfy. The transformation of the Ironborn themselves began to accelerate as Euron's influence spread throughout his kingdom. Traditional concepts of honor and proper conduct were gradually replaced by more flexible approaches that prioritized effectiveness over adherence to ancient customs. Young reavers who had grown up hearing stories of the old way found themselves learning techniques that their grandfathers would have considered blasphemous, but which produced results that could not be argued with. The Shield Islands became the testing ground for these new approaches to warfare. Rather than simply raiding these strategic positions and withdrawing with whatever plunder could be quickly gathered, Euron's forces occupied the islands permanently and began transforming them into bases for extended operations. The local populations that survived the initial conquest found themselves incorporated into an economic system that was more sophisticated but also more ruthlessly exploitative than anything they had previously experienced. Lords established on the conquered islands represented a new breed of Ironborn nobility whose loyalty derived from shared participation in enterprises that went far beyond traditional reaving. These men understood that their continued prosperity depended entirely upon their king's favor, creating bonds of dependency that were stronger than blood kinship or ancient oaths. Their success in managing conquered territories provided models that could be replicated as the invasion expanded into more valuable regions. The psychological impact of these early victories extended far beyond their immediate strategic value. News of Ironborn forces using previously unknown tactics and achieving unprecedented results spread throughout Westeros, creating fear that went beyond rational assessment of military capabilities. Stories of Euron's supernatural abilities grew with each retelling, transforming him from a mere political rival into something approaching a force of nature that conventional opposition could not hope to contain. As autumn deepened into winter, and reports of Victarion's progress in Slaver's Bay began to arrive through mysterious channels, Euron stood on Pyke's highest tower and surveyed a kingdom that had been transformed beyond recognition. The Iron Islands had become the center of a web that extended across oceans and continents, connecting resources and capabilities that no previous ruler had possessed. The boy who had once tormented his younger brother in the castle's shadows had evolved into something that transcended ordinary categories of human ambition, and his true work was only beginning. The Iron Fleet that departed from Pyke bore little resemblance to the traditional longships that had carried Ironborn raiders for thousands of years. Euron had spent the winter months transforming his naval forces into something unprecedented in Westerosi warfare, combining the speed and maneuverability that made Ironborn seamanship legendary with innovations borrowed from military traditions across the known world. The result was an armada capable of projecting power far beyond anything his ancestors had imagined possible. The Shield Islands fell within days of the fleet's arrival, their defenses crumbling before assault techniques that seemed to blend conventional warfare with forces that defenders could neither understand nor effectively counter. Lord Hewitt's castle, which had withstood sieges for centuries through its commanding position and well-supplied garrison, surrendered after its walls began bleeding a substance that drove men mad with a single touch. Grim and Greenshield suffered similar fates, their traditional fortifications proving utterly inadequate against enemies who fought according to rules that existed beyond normal military understanding. Euron established his headquarters on Oakenshield, the largest and most strategically positioned of the conquered islands. From this base, he could control shipping lanes that carried grain from the Reach to hungry populations throughout Westeros, giving him leverage over the entire continent's food supply that went far beyond simple military conquest. The transformation of the island's main castle reflected his expanded ambitions, its halls now filled with artifacts and personnel that would have seemed utterly alien to its previous occupants. The placement of his supporters as lords of the conquered territories revealed the sophistication of Euron's long-term planning. These were not traditional Ironborn captains elevated beyond their capabilities, but carefully selected individuals whose skills complemented the unique challenges of ruling mainland populations. Each possessed abilities that made them valuable beyond their loyalty, creating an administrative system that could actually function rather than merely extract wealth through crude exploitation. Nut the Barber received lordship over Oakenshield itself, his talents for extracting information through carefully applied pain, making him uniquely suited for managing a population that would undoubtedly harbor resentments against their new rulers. Left-hand Lucas Codd gained control of Greenshield, his experience with mainland customs allowing him to maintain the appearance of normal governance while systematically stripping away resources that would fuel continued expansion. The bastard knights who served Euron brought legitimacy that pure Ironborn rule could never have achieved. These men understood mainland law and custom sufficiently to maintain functional relationships with surviving local authorities, preventing the complete collapse of civil order that might have undermined the economic benefits of conquest. Their presence also demonstrated that the new regime was something more than simple reaving elevated to a larger scale. But it was the treatment of captured populations that most clearly revealed how thoroughly Euron's methods had evolved beyond traditional Ironborn practices. Rather than taking salt wives and killing excess males, according to ancient custom, the conquerors implemented systems of control that were more sophisticated and ultimately more effective than crude violence. Fear was applied with surgical precision, targeting specific individuals whose cooperation or elimination would produce maximum psychological impact on their communities. The pregnant Thalia flowers represented the most disturbing example of Euron's approach to managing conquered peoples. Lord Hewitt's bastard daughter had been singled out not for her beauty or family connections, but because her pregnancy by the new king served specific purposes in the magical workings that were becoming central to his military success. The child she carried possessed royal blood through paternal lineage, making both mother and unborn infant valuable components in rituals that required very particular types of sacrifice. Reports of Euron's activities began spreading throughout the Reach with the speed that only true terror could achieve. Unlike previous Ironborn raids that had been limited to coastal areas easily accessible to swift-moving longships, this invasion was penetrating deep into territories that had considered themselves safe from seaborne assault. The techniques being employed seemed to violate natural law as well as military convention, creating a psychological impact that went far beyond any rational assessment of enemy capabilities. Lord Randall Tarley's response to the Ironborn invasion demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of traditional mainland military thinking. His forces were well trained and adequately equipped for conventional warfare, but they had no experience dealing with enemies who employed supernatural capabilities as standard tactical elements. Initial engagements resulted in defeats that seemed to defy logical explanation, with veteran soldiers fleeing from opponents who should have been easily contained through superior numbers and positioning. The siege of Old Town represented Euron's most audacious gambit, targeting a city whose size and strategic importance made it seem impossible for any seaborne force to threaten seriously. The High Tower had stood unconquered for thousands of years, its massive walls and strategic position making it one of the most formidable defensive installations in Westeros. But Euron possessed advantages that previous attackers had lacked, knowledge and resources that transformed apparently impossible undertakings into achievable objectives. The Citadel's presence in Old Town added layers of complexity that went far beyond simple military considerations. The Maesters maintained libraries that contained knowledge accumulated over centuries of scholarly research, including texts that dealt with subjects that the Iron Throne preferred to keep forgotten. Euron's interest in these repositories had nothing to do with conventional strategic value, and everything to do with his ongoing quest for understanding forces that could reshape reality according to his will. Samwell Tarly's presence among the Maesters created ironies that would have been amusing under different circumstances. The craven son of Lord Randall had fled to the Citadel to escape a military career that terrified him, only to find himself at the center of a conflict that made traditional warfare seem gentle by comparison. His knowledge of both northern politics and Citadel secrets made him valuable to multiple factions, though none of the interested parties seemed particularly concerned with his personal survival. The magical aspects of Euron's siege techniques began manifesting in ways that could no longer be dismissed as exaggerated rumors. Defenders reported attacks by creatures that seemed to be composed of shadow and malice rather than flesh and blood, assaults that came from directions that should have been impossible to approach, and weapons that inflicted wounds that refused to heal according to natural processes. The city's spiritual defenses, maintained by septons whose faith had protected Old Town for generations, proved inadequate against forces that drew power from sources beyond conventional religious understanding. The psychological impact of these supernatural elements extended far beyond their immediate tactical utility. Soldiers who had faced human enemies with reasonable courage found themselves paralyzed by terror when confronted with phenomena that their minds refused to process as possible. Officers who had managed conventional sieges with competent skill discovered that their entire understanding of military science had become obsolete overnight, leaving them unable to provide effective leadership when their men most needed guidance. The economic disruption caused by Euron's campaign began affecting regions far from the actual fighting. Grain shipments that normally flowed from the Reach to population centers throughout Westeros were interrupted, creating food shortages that threatened to destabilize areas that had remained neutral in the larger conflict. The Ironborn blockade of major ports prevented not only military resupply but also the civilian commerce that sustained urban populations during the difficult winter months. King's Landing felt the effects of these disruptions almost immediately, as food prices rose and angry crowds began gathering in squares where royal proclamations were typically announced. The Iron Throne's ability to maintain order in the capital depended heavily upon keeping the population fed and reasonably content, but Euron's activities were undermining both of these essential requirements. Reports reaching the Red Keep described a military situation that seemed to be spiraling beyond any conventional response. The transformation of the Ironborn themselves accelerated during these campaigns, as exposure to their king's methods gradually altered their understanding of what was possible and permissible. Men who had grown up believing that strength and courage were sufficient for victory found themselves wielding powers that would have terrified their ancestors, participating in rituals that transformed warfare into something approaching religious ceremony. The cost of these transformations was becoming apparent in ways that extended far beyond simple battlefield casualties. As autumn deepened toward winter and the siege of Old Town continued with no resolution in sight, Euron stood on the deck of the Silence and surveyed a campaign that was exceeding even his most optimistic projections. The Reach was bleeding resources that would fuel expanded operations. The mainland's military capabilities were proving inadequate against his evolved tactics. and the reputation he was building would serve him well in future negotiations with powers that valued strength above all other considerations. But success was also bringing him closer to confrontations that would test abilities he had spent years developing, challenges that would determine whether his transformation from exiled prince to supernatural force had been sufficient to achieve the ultimate prizes he sought. In the bowels of the silence, where no natural light had penetrated for years, Euron Damphair hung from chains that had been forged in the deepest furnaces of Ashai. The metal burned his flesh with cold that seemed to leach warmth from his very soul, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the systematic destruction of everything he had believed about divine justice and brotherly love. Here, in a chamber that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time, Euron was conducting an education that would strip away the last vestiges of faith from a man who had devoted his life to serving the drowned god. The capture itself had been almost anticlimactically simple. Aradan had been traveling between the smaller islands, performing the sacred rites that bound the Ironborn to their ancient deity, when the silence had appeared out of fog so thick that it seemed more like substance than weather. His escorts had fought bravely but briefly, their conventional weapons proving utterly inadequate against enemies who moved with supernatural speed and struck with forces that bypassed armor entirely. The priest had expected death and would have welcomed it as release from a world that was growing too dark for honorable men to endure. Instead, he found himself in a place that challenged every assumption he had made about the nature of reality and suffering. The ship's lower decks had been transformed into something that resembled the torture chambers of legend more than any conventional vessel's interior, but the implements of pain arranged with such careful precision served purposes that went far beyond simple physical torment. They were designed to break minds as well as bodies, to strip away the psychological structures that allowed human beings to maintain their sanity in the face of overwhelming horror. Euron's visits followed patterns that revealed the depth of planning that had gone into his brother's psychological destruction. Sometimes he would arrive in the guise of loving family member, expressing concern for Aeron's condition and offering relief that came at the price of small compromises with previously held convictions. Other times he appeared as the monster he had truly become, demonstrating abilities that made mockery of every prayer the priest had ever offered to his supposedly omnipotent god. The revelations about their shared childhood arrived like physical blows, each memory carefully chosen to maximize psychological damage while simultaneously explaining behaviors that had puzzled Euron for decades. The nightmares that had plagued his youth had not been products of an overactive imagination or divine testing, but actual experiences suppressed by a mind too young to process their true horror. Euron had been using him as an experimental subject even then, practicing techniques that would later prove useful in breaking far more resilient opponents. The truth about their father's knowledge of these abuses cut deeper than any blade could have reached. Lord Quellan had been aware of his third son's proclivities, but had chosen to ignore them for reasons that had more to do with political calculation than parental blindness. The modernizing lord had recognized that Euron possessed abilities that might prove useful in future conflicts, even if their development required sacrifices that conventional morality would have condemned. Victorian's wife had been merely the most visible victim in a pattern of behavior that stretched back to their earliest childhood. The woman whose beauty had supposedly driven Euron to risk exile and fraternal conflict had actually been selected as a target because her destruction would accomplish multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. Her death had removed a potential source of heirs who might have complicated succession questions, while the scandal had provided perfect justification for sending the most dangerous Greyjoy brother into exile, at precisely the moment when his presence was becoming politically inconvenient. The pregnancy that had resulted from their brief liaison had never been about passion or even revenge, but about creating a source of king's blood that could be harvested at the appropriate time for magical purposes that required very specific types of sacrifice. The child had been murdered in the womb through rituals that had increased Euron's power, while simultaneously ensuring that no bastard could ever challenge his eventual claim to the throne. Valyria flowers represented the continuation of patterns that had defined Euron's approach to human relationships since childhood. The young woman had been selected not for her beauty or family connections, but because her pregnancy could serve the same purposes that Victarion's wives had fulfilled decades earlier. The child she carried possessed royal blood through paternal lineage, making both mother and unborn infant valuable components in workings that would fuel the next phase of his supernatural development. The systematic use of human sacrifice to power magical workings revealed the true cost of Euron's transformation from ambitious prince to supernatural force. Each ritual required specific types of victims whose deaths would provide the precise energies needed for particular purposes. Royal blood possessed unique properties that made it valuable for bindings and compulsions, while the life force of children offered power that could be used to extend the practitioner's own vitality and capabilities. The pregnant woman's fate had been sealed from the moment Euron decided she might prove useful to his larger purposes. The child she carried would be born only to die in ceremonies that would channel its innocent life force into magical workings of unprecedented scope and ambition. Valyria herself would survive only long enough to watch her infant sacrifice, her own death timed to maximize the psychological trauma that would flavor the final energies harvested from her destruction. Euron's forced witness to these preparations stripped away the last foundations of his religious faith. The drowned god, who had supposedly protected the Ironborn for thousands of years, remained silent in the face of blasphemies that surpassed anything described in the most forbidden texts. Prayer brought no relief from suffering, righteousness provided no protection against evil, and devotion earned no reward beyond continued torment at the hands of a brother who had abandoned every trace of human decency. The realization that his entire life had been built upon delusions came slowly but inevitably, each day bringing new evidence that the divine justice he had preached to others was nothing more than comfortable fiction designed to make unbearable realities seem tolerable. The strong preyed upon the weak without consequence, the wicked prospered while the righteous suffered, and the gods either did not exist or were too indifferent to intervene in mortal affairs that offended every principle of decency and mercy. The physical transformations that Euron underwent during his captivity reflected the spiritual destruction that Euron was systematically inflicting upon his psyche. The priest's body began to show signs of exposure to forces that existed beyond normal reality, his skin taking on qualities that seemed more mineral than organic, his eyes developing depths that reflected knowledge no sane man should possess. These changes were not accidental side effects but deliberate modifications that would make him more useful for the purposes his brother intended. The breaking point came when Euron was forced to acknowledge that his prayers for deliverance had been heard and answered, but not by the deity he had expected. The powers that responded to desperate appeals for aid in this place of ultimate horror were entities that fed on suffering and despair, beings whose intervention came at prices that made continued torment seem preferable to whatever relief they might provide. The choice between damnation and destruction was no choice at all, but Euron ensured that his brother understood exactly what options remained available to him. The final revelation that shattered the last remnants of Euron's sanity involved the true nature of the drowned god himself. The deity that the Ironborn had worshipped for millennia was not the benevolent father figure described in their prayers and hymns, but something far older and more alien that had been using their faith as a mechanism for harvesting the spiritual energy generated by devotion and sacrifice. Every prayer offered in good faith had been feeding something that viewed mortal concerns as beneath notice. Every life given in service had been consumed by hungers that could never be satisfied through normal means. As winter tightened its grip around the Iron Islands, and reports of Victarion's activities in Slaver's Bay began reaching Euron through channels that existed beyond normal communication, the broken priest hung in his chains, and understood that his brother's transformation had been guided by forces that made conventional ambition seem like childish fantasy. The boy who had once played cruel games in Pyke's shadows had become something that existed beyond human categories of good and evil, a creature whose very presence warped reality around it in ways that would eventually consume everything he had ever claimed to love or protect. The education was complete. Euron Damfair had learned the true nature of the world and his place within it, knowledge that would have driven him to madness if madness had not already become his only refuge from truths too terrible for any rational mind to accept. In the darkness beneath the deck of the Silence, surrounded by implements of torture and symbols of power that predated human civilization, the priest who had once brought hope to his people had become something else entirely. A warning of what awaited anyone foolish enough to believe that divine justice would ultimately protect the innocent from the predations of the truly evil. The waters off Old Town had turned the color of old blood by the time Lord Paxter Redwine's massive fleet appeared on the horizon, their banners streaming in winds that carried the salt scent of impending slaughter. The Arbor's Lord had assembled the largest naval force seen in Westerosi waters since the days of Aegon the Conqueror, nearly 200 warships carrying the finest sailors that generations of maritime tradition could produce. Against them, Euron's iron-born flotilla seemed almost laughably outnumbered, but appearances had become meaningless in waters where reality itself bent to accommodate the will of those who understood how to manipulate forces beyond conventional understanding. The Silence rode at anchor in the center of the Ironborn formation, her black sails furled, but somehow still seeming to catch wind that touched no other vessel in the fleet. On her deck, arrangements had been made that would have horrified even the most battle-hardened veterans of the War of Five Kings. Hundreds of prisoners from across the Reach lay bound in patterns that formed geometric designs, visible only from above, their placement calculated according to principles learned in the shadow temples of Ashai, where human sacrifice had been refined into precise science. Euron had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering victims whose deaths would provide the specific types of energy required for workings that would transform conventional naval warfare into something approaching divine intervention. Lords and ladies whose bloodlines stretched back to the Age of Heroes would anchor the spell in historical forces that had shaped Westeros since its earliest settlement. Knights whose valor had been proven in previous conflicts would contribute the martial energy needed to direct supernatural forces toward military purposes. Most precious of all were the children, their innocent life force providing the pure power that could break through barriers separating the physical world from realms of possibility that existed beyond normal perception. The morning preparations had an almost liturgical quality. Each action performed according to sequences that had been memorized through repetition that bordered on obsession. The dragon horn occupied the position of greatest honor at the ritual's heart, its Valyrian steel surface reflecting the gray sky with an intensity that seemed to drink light rather than simply bounce it back toward observers. Around it, other artifacts formed constellation patterns that would focus and amplify the energies released through systematic murder, creating channels through which power could flow from the realm of the dead into the world of the living. The Redwine captains approached their enemy with confidence built on centuries of successful naval engagements, their formations displaying the disciplined coordination that had made the Arbor's fleet legendary throughout the known world. They had faced pirates and raiders from every corner of the seas, defeating enemies through superior seamanship combined with tactical flexibility that allowed them to adapt to whatever strategies their opponents might employ. But nothing in their accumulated experience had prepared them for confrontation with forces that operated according to principles that transcended conventional military understanding. The ritual began with the death of a child so young that his cries seemed to harmonize with the wind in ways that made seasoned sailors weep without understanding why. His blood, still warm with life that had barely begun, flowed across symbols carved into the Silence's deck, following channels that guided it toward focal points where other substances waited to combine in mixtures that would fuel transformations beyond anything previously attempted in Westerosi waters. The boy's final breath carried with it energies that resonated across dimensions normally hidden from human perception, opening doorways between worlds that had remained sealed since the doom of Valyria had demonstrated the ultimate consequences of magical hubris carried too far. Each subsequent sacrifice added layers of complexity to workings that were already straining the boundaries of what reality could accommodate. Noble blood brought connections to historical forces that had shaped the continent's development across millennia, while the life force of proven warriors provided the aggressive energy needed to direct supernatural power toward destructive purposes. The pregnant woman whose unborn child represented the culmination of royal bloodline preservation died with screams that seemed to echo from futures that had not yet come to pass, her sacrifice opening channels through which power flowed that exceeded anything Euron had previously commanded. The transformation of the battle from conventional naval engagement to supernatural catastrophe began subtly, with changes so gradual that experienced sailors initially attributed them to natural phenomena they simply did not understand. The wind began following patterns that bore no relationship to weather systems, creating conditions that favored iron-borne maneuvers while hindering enemy formations in ways that seemed too convenient to be accidental. The water itself started behaving according to laws that had nothing to do with normal tidal forces, currents forming that could trap vessels or carry them toward positions where they became vulnerable to attacks from impossible angles. As the sun climbed toward its zenith and the slaughter reached its crescendo, the boundaries between the physical world and realms of power that existed beyond normal perception began to dissolve entirely. Creatures began manifesting on iron-borne ships that bore no resemblance to any species described in the Meister's bestiaries, their forms seeming to shift between states of matter that defied rational categorization. The air grew thick with energies that made breathing difficult and thinking even more challenging for anyone not protected by the ritual preparations that had shielded Euron's chosen followers from the worst effects of exposure to forces beyond human comprehension. The Red Wine sailors found themselves facing opposition that violated every principle of warfare that had been developed through centuries of maritime conflict. Enemy vessels that should have been overwhelmed by superior numbers instead moved with speed and coordination that suggested their crews were no longer operating according to normal human limitations. Arrows flew with accuracy that mocked the concept of chance, while ramming attacks succeeded despite positioning that should have made such tactics impossible to execute successfully. Lord Paxter himself witnessed transformations that would haunt his dreams for whatever time remained to him, assuming he survived the carnage that was systematically destroying everything he had spent his lifetime building. Ships in his own fleet began turning against their sister vessels without any apparent cause, their crews showing signs of possession or magical compulsion that made them more dangerous than external enemies. The disciplined formations that had been the pride of Arbor naval tradition dissolved into chaos as supernatural forces systematically corrupted the command structures that held the fleet together. The climactic moment of the battle arrived when Euron raised the dragon horn to his lips and released a sound that seemed to contain echoes of every dragon that had ever lived or would ever be born. The note that emerged carried harmonics that resonated not just across the immediate battlefield, but through time itself, touching moments in the past when similar horns had bound the greatest creatures in creation to the will of mortal sorcerers. Dragons might not have been present to answer this particular call, but the forces it summoned were no less devastating for being invisible to ordinary sight. The aftermath of the battle left waters that would remain stained for generations, their crimson hue a permanent reminder of the day when magic had returned to Westeros, not as subtle influence, but as undeniable reality that demanded acknowledgement from even the most skeptical observers. The Red Wine fleet had been utterly destroyed, not through conventional tactics but through powers that made traditional concepts of naval superiority seem quaint and outdated. Those few survivors who managed to reach friendly shores brought tales that most listeners dismissed as fever dreams or elaborate excuses for comprehensive military failure. Euron stood amid the wreckage of his enemies and felt the completion of a transformation that had begun in the ruins of Old Valyria. The boy who had once tormented his younger brother in Pyke's shadows had evolved into something that existed beyond human categories, a conduit for forces that could reshape reality according to his will. The knowledge he had purchased through years of sacrifice and study had finally borne fruit in ways that exceeded even his most ambitious projections, opening possibilities for future conquests that would dwarf everything he had previously accomplished. In the aftermath of the Battle of Blood, as the crimson waters slowly returned to their natural gray-green hue, the world found itself fundamentally altered in ways that would echo through generations yet unborn. The supernatural forces that Euron had unleashed could not be simply dismissed or forgotten like the outcome of conventional military engagements. Magic had returned to Westeros not as subtle influence or hidden practice, but as undeniable reality that demanded acknowledgement from even the most skeptical observers. The age of purely mundane politics and warfare had ended in fire and sacrifice, replaced by something far more dangerous and infinitely more unpredictable. The immediate consequences of Euron's victory rippled outward from the battlefield like waves from a stone cast into still water. The Reach, which had fed the Seven Kingdoms for centuries through its fertile fields and abundant harvests, now lay under the dominion of a ruler whose methods made traditional conquest seem gentle by comparison. The noble houses that had survived the initial invasion found themselves governing territories where the natural order had been permanently disrupted, where crops grew according to alien patterns, and livestock bore young that resembled their parents only in the most superficial ways. The Iron Islands themselves had been transformed beyond recognition during Euron's brief but intensive reign. The ancient halls of Pyke now echoed with sounds that had never been heard in any mortal dwelling, while the castle's foundations pulsed with energies that seemed to draw strength from the surrounding sea. The Ironborn who remained loyal to their king discovered that their traditional way of life had evolved into something that their ancestors would have found both magnificent and terrifying, a synthesis of familiar customs and alien knowledge that created possibilities their people had never imagined. Yet the true measure of Euron's impact extended far beyond the territories he had conquered or the subjects he now ruled. The very nature of power in Westeros had shifted, forcing every surviving faction to reconsider strategies that had been developed for a world where human limitations remained constant. The Game of Thrones that had once been played according to rules established by centuries of precedent now operated in a realm where those rules could be rewritten by anyone possessing sufficient knowledge of forces that transcended ordinary political calculation. The other claimants to royal authority found themselves facing challenges that no amount of conventional military strength could address. Dragons flying over Slaver's Bay represented one form of supernatural threat, but Euron's mastery of powers that could reshape reality itself posed questions that had no answers in traditional political theory. How could armies march against enemies who could summon storms from clear skies? How could castles provide protection against sieges conducted through means that made physical walls irrelevant? The maesters of the Citadel, those who had survived the siege of Old Town, began the long process of revising their understanding of natural philosophy to accommodate phenomena that their predecessors had dismissed as superstition. The great library's surviving texts took on new significance as scholars realized that many accounts they had classified as myth or legend actually contained practical information about forces that were once again active in the world. Knowledge that had been preserved as historical curiosity suddenly became urgently relevant to anyone hoping to survive in an age where the impossible had become commonplace. The common people of Westeros experienced these changes in ways that were both more immediate and more profound than the political maneuvering of their social superiors. Seasons began following patterns that owed more to magical influence than natural cycles, while familiar animals and plants displayed characteristics that suggested fundamental alterations to the biological processes that sustained life itself. Children born after the Battle of Blood showed abilities that their parents could neither understand nor control, gifts that marked them as belonging to a generation that would grow up in a world utterly different from the one their elders had known. But perhaps the most significant transformation was the one that had occurred within Euron himself during his journey from exiled prince to supernatural force. The man who had once been content to torment his younger brother in the shadows of Pyke had evolved into something that existed beyond the normal boundaries of human experience. His single eye now held depths that reflected knowledge purchased through sacrifices that would have destroyed anyone less thoroughly prepared for the costs of ultimate power. He had achieved his childhood dreams of dominance and control, but in doing so had surrendered the capacity for normal human emotion and connection. The price of his transformation became apparent in the emptiness that surrounded him despite his unprecedented authority. The mute crew of the Silence served with absolute loyalty, but could offer no companionship to someone who had moved beyond the need for ordinary human interaction. The lords who had been elevated to rule conquered territories showed him the deference that his power demanded, but their fear prevented the development of relationships that might have provided meaning beyond the mere exercise of authority. Family bonds that had once provided structure and purpose in his life had been systematically destroyed through his own actions. Victarion's fate in Slavers Bay remained uncertain, but even if the Iron Captain survived his mission, the relationship between the brothers could never be restored to anything resembling normal affection. Arion's complete psychological destruction had removed the last person who remembered Euron as he had been before exile, had begun his transformation into something beyond human categories. Ashar's absence from the Iron Islands served as a reminder of paths not taken and choices that could not be unmade. Her practical vision of Ironborn future had been rendered irrelevant by developments that transcended the political and economic considerations she had championed, but her survival offered the possibility that some remnant of the old ways might persist beyond her uncle's reign. Whether such preservation would prove blessing or curse remained unclear to anyone attempting to peer into futures that had become fundamentally unpredictable. The legacy that Euron had created would endure long after his physical form returned to the sea that had shaped all Ironborn destinies. The magical forces he had awakened could not be dismissed or contained through conventional means, while the knowledge he had introduced to the Westeros would continue influencing events through students and survivors who had witnessed demonstrations of power that redefined the possible. The world would never again be able to pretend that human ambition was constrained by natural law or divine providence. As winter deepened and the transformed Reach settled into patterns that bore little resemblance to its historical rhythms, the gray-green waters around the Iron Islands began to calm from the supernatural storms that had marked Euron's rise to power. The ancient sea that had witnessed the birth and death of countless Ironborn ambitions now reflected skies that seemed somehow different from those that had shone upon previous generations, as if the very heavens had been altered by events that had pushed reality beyond its normal boundaries. In the depths of those eternal waters, currents moved according to laws that predated human civilization, carrying away the blood and suffering that had fueled the greatest magical working in centuries, while simultaneously preserving the memory of transformation that had changed everything. The tide that rose and fell with mechanical regularity served as reminder that some forces remained constant even when the world above was reshaped by ambitions that recognized no limits save those imposed by imagination and will. The Iron Islands slept now beneath stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, their ancient stones holding secrets that would outlive the current generation and all who would follow. In the gentle rhythm of waves against weathered cliffs, there echoed the promise that even the most terrible storms eventually pass, leaving behind silence that invites the deep rest that comes only after the most challenging trials have been endured and overcome.